All right, good Thursday evening, everyone. This is the long version of the 2016-2017 winter forecast for the Mahoning and Shenango Valleys in Northeast Ohio and western parts of Pennsylvania. On 21 News at 6, I did a 3-minute version of this forecast. I'll do that again at 11. I'm restricted by time on TV, and so I can only say so much. Got a lot more to say. So we're going to do just like we did last year, we're going to do a long version of the winter forecast. We're going to focus mostly on the meteorological winter months, December, January, and February. As you know, it can snow and be cold into March and even parts of April, and parts of November can be cold and snowy sometimes, but we're going to focus mostly on the winter season. Before I get to that, though, real quick word about later this month. It's been a mild fall so far, mild start to November. It's going to stay mild for at least another week to 10 days. Now, we're not going to see the mid-70s like we just had, but we're going to see a lot of above-average temperatures through the middle of the month. This, hot off the press, is the latest European model forecast for days 14 through 21, showing a pattern change, maybe briefly, but a pattern change nonetheless, right in the third week of the month as we get closer to Thanksgiving, showing some colder than average temperatures perhaps in the east. Now, do I think this is bitter cold? No, at this point I don't. But I do think it will be a noticeable change compared to what preceded it earlier on in November. So that's later this month as we get a little bit closer to Thanksgiving. All right, before we look at this year's forecast, let's review last year. I get asked before I do forecasts like this, well, how'd you do last year with the forecast? Well, this was our forecast put out a year ago for the winter season. We forecasted a warmer than average winter across the northern tier of states and a colder than average winter in the southern tier. And in eastern Ohio and western PA, we kind of thought it would come out to be about 1 degree to perhaps 2 degrees above the average in terms of temperatures for the winter season. That's what our forecast was. Here's what happened across the country. It was warmer than average almost everywhere, with the exception of some parts of the southwest. So we were, this was a pretty good forecast up here across the northern tier of states. We don't live down here, if you're watching this video, but a little off the mark in the southern tier where it was also warmer than average. Keep in mind these numbers. Last year at the airport, 45 inches of snow. Now, the average at the airport is 60 inches. So we were 15 inches below average. It depends on where you live, how much snow you typically see in a winter. In Columbiana County, average is about 30, 35. Northern Trumbull, northern Mercer, the average is closer to 70. At the airport, it's 60. That's where the official measurements are taken. Temperature is 5.3 degrees above the average last winter. That's what happened last year. A few other stats about last year. The numbers last year were skewed because of December, which was the warmest on record in Youngstown. It was remarkably warm. You might remember it was in the 60s on Christmas Eve last December. Because of that, mostly because of that really warm December, it ended up being the 8th warmest winter on record. Now, January and February were certainly colder than December, but they weren't super cold. But December was so remarkably warm that it did skew the numbers somewhat last winter, making it the 8th warmest on record. Least snow last winter since 2001-2002. So snowfall amounts were fairly unimpressive. Here's a look at the last 20 or so winters. Ups and downs, of course. The purple line is average in terms of temperatures. 11, 12, and 12, 13 were mild winters, but then we had those back-to-back frigid winters in 2013, 14, and 14, 15, followed by a complete reversal last year. So that's kind of recent history in terms of temperatures, in terms of snow. We had some relatively tame winters in terms of snow in the late 90s. A lot of the aughts, if you will, that decade featured some snowy winters. 2011-12 was not all that snowy, just a little bit below average. And then we had a few snowy winters from 12-13 through 14-15. Last year was, of course, below average. Now, this list is completely subjective, I'll admit that. But this is a list I put together last year of the worst winters in the last 40 years in our area. Notice all the recent ones on here, including 2010-11. We had twice the amount of snow as par and 3.5 degrees below average. We had back-to-back really tough ones, 13-14 and 14-15. They were the worst winters generally since the famous winters back in the 70s. So we, a lot of us were very happy that we got a break last year because the previous 2 winters were pretty tough. All right, how do we make these forecasts? Sometimes I'll get a comment from the peanut gallery. Hey, you can't even get tomorrow right. How in the world are you predicting what's going to happen over the winter? Cliched weather people are always wrong jokes, which frankly are kind of lame. But the question is a good one. How do you make these forecasts? And basically there's 3 things that I came up with that go into kind of the secret sauce here. One of the things we do is we look to the past in order to look to the future. We call these analogs. These are years in which the atmosphere and the oceans have a similar makeup to what's going on now and what's expected to happen in the next couple of months. Ocean water temperatures. It's strange to think of it, but ocean water temperatures are very important when making a seasonal forecast because the atmosphere and the ocean are very closely linked. The ocean can make the atmosphere do things. And so we go back and we try to find years that had similar temperature makeup in the Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, other oceans, as well as other years that had similar things going on in the atmosphere above our heads. We also look at computer models. Computer models projecting forward a few months. What are they showing? Some are better than others. And of course, a lot of this is experience and intuition. The more experienced you are at this stuff, the more liable you are to avoid traps. I've been doing this for 15 years, although I've only been trying to make seasonal forecasts for 3 or 4. But I've fallen into a lot of traps in forecasts that go out 12 hours and forecasts that go out a few months. And you learn from those. And so that becomes a big part of how you make these forecasts as well. All right. Last year, record strong El Nino. El Nino, the warming of the waters in the equatorial Pacific Ocean. Right over here is South America. Up here is Mexico. This is where we are. This year, we don't have an El Nino. We have La Nina, but it's weak. Last year, very strong El Nino. This year, weak La Nina, which is the opposite. It's the cooling of the water in this part of the Pacific Ocean. Well, what in the world does that have to do with our weather? Well, again, the ocean water temperatures make the atmosphere do things. And not every time we have a La Nina, but a fair percentage of the time, a La Nina leads to a wetter than average winter in the Pacific Northwest, drier than average in the Southwest, and a wetter than average winter in parts of the Midwest, the Great Lakes, the Ohio Valley. Not every La Nina is the same. Just like last year, not every El Nino is the same. And the weaker La Nina or El Nino is, the confidence in your forecast goes down if it's weaker. When the signal's very strong, like last year's forecast was fairly easy because El Nino was bound and determined to overwhelm the pattern in the northern hemisphere, and it became easy to see how that would influence our weather. This year, with La Nina being weak, other things other than La Nina can steer the weather patterns across our part of the globe, and those things are harder to see on the scale of a couple of months ahead of time. Those things are easier to see a week or two ahead of time, but when we're talking 90 days, 180 days out, those other things, which I don't have really time to get into in this video, are harder to see on that kind of scale. And those kinds of things can overwhelm the pattern if La Nina is weak. So that's a challenge we have ahead of us. La Nina, again, cooling of the waters in the Pacific Ocean. A little graphic snafu there, never mind that. All right, one of the things we look at this time of the year is the buildup of the snowpack in the northern latitudes. Why do we do this? There's some research in the last few years, pretty recent research, this is a pretty new idea, that shows that if the snowpack buildup is rapid and even faster than average in northern Canada, especially over the pole, over into Siberia and Eurasia, if that buildup is faster than average, that is a signal that can do things to the atmosphere that can oftentimes lead to a colder than average winter in the eastern U.S. Now, last year we had a rapid buildup of the snowpack at this time of the year here, but it did not lead to a colder than average winter in the east because El Nino just overwhelmed everything. This year, this has a chance to be more of a factor. This year, the snowpack buildup has been rapid again, faster than average. It's been a cold fall in this part of the world. So that increases the chances of a somewhat colder than average winter in the eastern U.S. Mention those analogs, those years that have similar setups to this year. Here, there's probably 12 or 13 years that went into this formula towards making the winter forecast. These are the top 5. These are the 5 that are most similar to what's going on now and what we expect to have happen over the next couple of months. One of these is 1983-84, which was a weak La Nina, which followed a strong El Nino. That's what we have now. We had a strong El Nino, now we have a weak La Nina. 83-84 was very similar. Other years were similar for some reasons, but 83-84 perhaps the most similar in terms of the El Nino setup. Now, again, we look at other things. El Nino, La Nina is just part of the equation. But as you can see, there's a mixed bag here. Some of these were snowier than average. Again, average is about 60 inches. Some were warmer than average. Some were cooler than average. Again, making the forecast perhaps a little bit tough from that standpoint. All right, this December, we're getting into the forecast now. We expect in December the coldest temperatures compared to average to be across the northern tier of states, warm in the southwest. Apologize for the flashing. If you see some flashing behind me here, I'm not sure why it's doing that. But anyway, December. Remember last December, we were 12 degrees above the average. I think from year to year, a comparison from last year to this year, December is going to be the month that we notice the change the most. We're not going to have a super warm December like we did last year. I'm forecasting December to be a degree to 2 degrees below average. Now, that's not a huge number, but it is compared to last year. And when we look at the winter as a whole, there's a chance, actually, that December ends up being the coldest month of the winter season compared to average. Now, climatologically, January is the coldest month. That's when typically our temperatures are at their coldest. But compared to averages, the averages are higher in December, historically speaking. Compared to average, December might be our coldest month of the winter. Expecting a bit of a pullback in January. The coldest anomalies maybe up towards Montana and the Dakotas, and you might see some ridging taking place over the southeastern U.S., leading some mild temperatures there. And I'm expecting a fairly typical January temperature-wise here. Colder than average to our west, warmer than average to our southeast. So again, December, maybe a degree or two below average. January, pretty close to average. After that, a little bit of a pullback in January. We might see cold visiting more often again in February. And so I'm forecasting February to be, again, about a degree or two below average. February is the month that I have the least amount of confidence in, and that's not real surprising. That's the month that's farthest out. I'm probably most confident in December and least confident in February. So that's kind of a month-by-month breakdown. I would expect, compared to average, January to be the tamest month. Now, it still might be the coldest month in the absolute temperatures, but again, it's supposed to be cold in January. It's supposed to be the coldest month of the year. Compared to average, it might actually be the most decent month of the winter season. For the winter as a whole, December, January, February, here's the forecast. Again, coldest anomalies, northern tier of states. Expecting for the winter as a whole for us to come out a degree-ish, maybe 2, below the average. And warmest case scenario, we might even be close to average or even slightly above average if the warmer ideas work out. But right now, I think, compared to average, close to or somewhat below average temperature-wise for the winter. All right, snowfall. Of course, your mileage varies depending on where you live. We have the secondary snow belt in northern Trumbull and northern Mercer. They naturally get a lot more snow up there. Here is what we expect for snow, and this doesn't just cover December, January, February. This is basically first flake to last flake. A lot of times our last snowflakes and our last accumulating snows are in April. So, this forecast is basically from now to April. All of these numbers are about 5 to 10% above the average for each location, and about 30% more than what we got last year. So, it's a pretty significant change compared to last year. Again, as you would expect, the highest numbers in the north, the lowest numbers in the south. But all of these numbers are a little bit above average. Winter weather impacts for this year. And again, this is more of a comparison between this year and last. Expect higher energy bills this winter compared to last year. Expect more salt usage for the departments of transportation this year. Could be more problems with potholes and that sort of thing compared to last year. Also, the potential is there for more school adjustments, delays, cancellations compared to last year. So a year-by-year comparison. All right, bottom line here. This should be the most average, just sort of typical winter in Northeast Ohio, Western PA since 2009-2010 in terms of snow and temperatures. We've had some cold winters and some mild winters in the last 5 years. Overall, this should be the most average since 2009-10. December, the biggest change from last year. December last year was remarkably warm, the warmest on record. This year has a chance to be colder than average. Snowfall for the season in most spots should be near to slightly above the average. So at 15 minutes, I think I'm going to wrap this up. That's this year's winter forecast. Thanks for watching if you stuck with me through the whole thing. We'll be updating this forecast as we get into December and see how the pattern is evolving. So stay tuned for those updates, and stay tuned for more updates on your local weather and everything else you need to know weather-wise. This is the place to be. On my weather blog, on your Storm Tracker 21 app, and on 21 News at 6 and 11, and other times of the day as well.